My name is Steve Zeltzer, and I'm a member of the Pacific Media Workers Guild, which is part of the News Guild, CWA, and I produce a radio show called Work Week, and also I'm a Pacifica producer. I produce a show called Capitalism, Race, and Democracy. The reason we are having this workshop on Histadrut is that, first of all, most workers in this country do not know, if they're in the AFL-CIO, that the AFL-CIO is affiliated to the Histadrut, which is the Israeli Trade Union Federation, and that the AFL-CIO actually supports the Histadrut and operates with the Histadrut around the world. The Histadrut is a Zionist trade union federation. It was set up actually to get Jewish labor in Israel. They believed that Jews, if they were going to be taking over the land of Palestine, they needed their own labor group. And the Histadrut actually organized against Arab workers, saying that you could only buy things from Jewish labor. So it was a racist labor federation to begin with. So the Histadrut was formed. The State of Israel was a Zionist project. In the 1890s, in reaction to anti-Semitism in Russia and pogroms in Russia, there was a guy named Herzl who came up with the idea that there needed the solution to anti-Semitism was to set up a Jewish state. That if we had a Jewish state, that would solve the problem of anti-Semitism. And also they believed that Jews should stay together. The Jews should stay with themselves so that they can have their own state. Now this ideology is a racist ideology. It says that you shouldn't have a secular state where all workers are equal, but that you should have a state just for Jews, like a Muslim state for Muslims or a Christian state for Christians. That's the same ideology. So the Zionist movement actually worked with imperialists to get this Jewish state, Israel. They worked with the British, and they made a deal with the Balfour Agreement. The Balfour Agreement gave land to Jews. And also, most people don't know about it, but the Zionists actually worked with the Nazis. The Zionists invited Adolf Eichmann to Palestine to get support for the idea of a Jewish state. As a matter of fact, there was a film in Israel that was made about some grandchildren who were going through their grandparents' closets after they passed away, and they discovered that their grandparents had been meeting with Nazi officials wearing Nazi uniforms. They were completely shocked. How could this be that their grandparents were meeting with Nazi people? Turns out their grandparents were Zionists who worked with Nazis to get support for the Nazis, and they made a deal with the Nazis that Zionists could get rid of their property, give it to the Zionists, and then they could go to Palestine. So there was an agreement with the Nazis to help populate Palestine with Jews. Now, at the same time, before the Second World War, most Jews in the United States were secular. They didn't believe in a Jewish state. They believed that they were Americans. They believed in equality. And after the war, the Zionists said, what we have to do is bring people to Israel, and the only solution for anti-Semitism is to have a Jewish state. So in the AFL, before the AFL-CIO, the AFL-CIO supported this ideology. In other words, the leadership of the American Federation of Labor believed in a Jewish state. They supported that, and they gave money. They gave millions of dollars of U.S. money, bonds, to buy bonds. They had a bond program, and they gave millions of dollars to Zionists to set up the Jewish state. When Israel was declared, and the United States, not only did the United States support Israel, but the Soviet Union supported Israel, formation of Israel. What they did was that they said, we have to have Jewish labor. We have to increase the number of Jews coming to Israel. And this is a Jewish trade union federation, but it's different than most trade unions because it's also businesses. So the Histadrut, although it represents Jewish workers, also has businesses, government businesses. Social Security, they collect money, and they also do investments. And one of the investments that the Histadrut did was in South Africa, because during the apartheid regime, the biggest supporter of South Africa, the apartheid regime, was Israel. Israel worked with the South African regime to give them supplies, weapons, nuclear weapons. They did nuclear training. They also trained Histadrut in Israel, trained blacks in this group called Inkatha, Chief Buthelezi. I don't know if people have heard of what happened in South Africa during the apartheid regime, but the apartheid regime supported this chief Buthelezi in Zululand, and they gave him weapons and money. They had a training camp in Namibia to train these supporters how to kill. And they killed thousands of trade unionists in South Africa. COSATU trade unionists, workers who were organizing in Durban and other places in South Africa, were killed by these workers who were supported by Israel and supported by the Histadrut. So the other thing that happened, so the Histadrut gave weapons and they had military supplies. If you go to the Anti-Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, you'll see these tanks in that museum. They don't mention in that museum that Israel was supporting South Africa. That's left out of it. So Histadrut played an important role in supporting the apartheid regime. So the AFL-CIO, when the AFL-CIO formed, the AFL-CIO was formed as part of an anti-communist witch hunt in the United States. In other words, during the 50s, communists and militant socialists were kicked out of the unions. There was a political purge. And they wanted pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist unions. And that's what the AFL-CIO. The AFL-CIO supports capitalism, and the AFL-CIO worked with the CIA, and they set up the Solidarity Center. First, they set up organizations called the American Institute of Free Labor Development and other international organizations, which were directly funded by the CIA. And guess what they were involved in? They were involved in overthrowing governments in Brazil, in Argentina, in Chile in 1971. The Chilean coup was supported by the AFL-CIO. They actually supported the coup, and they helped support truck drivers in Chile, small businessmen who own trucks, to have a strike to overthrow the Allende government. So we're talking about an international apparatus of the AFL-CIO that collaborated with the United States and U.S. imperialism. And after they got money from the CIA, that became a scandal in the church hearings, because people said, why is the AFL-CIO, why is the CIA involved in overthrowing governments? So what they did is they set up another organization called the National Endowment for Democracy, NED. And the NED gives $75 million to the Solidarity Center, its last budget. They operate in over 62 countries. They operate in Colombia. They operate in supporting coups. They supported the coup in Venezuela, the AFL-CIO. So they have an international apparatus paid for by our tax dollars all over the world. Now, what does that have to do with the Histadrut? Because the Histadrut actually trained people in the AIFLD at the training center in Israel. They have a training center, the Histadrut, and CIA agents were going to that training center, so-called labor people, to be trained in the Histadrut, and then to go into El Salvador, where they had a reform land program supported by the AFL-CIO. So the AFL-CIO has been intertwined with the Histadrut for decades, many, many decades. And they have a committee that they set up, the Zionist committee, called the Jewish Labor Committee. I don't know if anyone has heard about the Jewish Labor Committee. The Jewish Labor Committee has Zionist leaders of unions, and what they said was, the Jewish Labor Committee, they said that if you want a resolution passed around the Middle East, you have to get it approved by the Jewish Labor Committee before it can go anywhere in the AFL-CIO. And we're going to have a speaker about that experience, because this Jewish Labor Committee blocked resolutions in solidarity with the Palestinians. They said, you can't talk about that. The Jewish Labor Committee has the right to shut you down. This is in the AFL-CIO. So imagine that. There's a Zionist Labor Committee as part of the AFL-CIO, and it can say whether or not you can have a discussion about Israel and about the Palestinians. So they were part of this project, this Zionist project that was happening in the United States. One of the struggles now is that Today, the San Francisco Labor Council tried to have a discussion. There were resolutions to support Palestine, and they said we can't talk about it. It's banned. And Liz Schuler, who is the president of the AFL-CIO, sent a letter in 2021, you can't talk about Palestine. You can't talk about a labor boycott because we haven't taken a position on that. We support Israel. So they actually had a position that was actually to stop a discussion and debate. And the Labor Council in San Francisco is unusual because that council actually opposed the Vietnam War. When the AFL-CIO was supporting the Vietnam War, the San Francisco Labor Council passed a resolution to oppose the Vietnam War. So that was unique.
That was easy.
That was easy, but actually it did that. So our next speaker, and we're going to talk about some recent actions, because this month, on the second Monday of this month, there was a rally at the San Francisco Labor Council by some workers who were calling for a general strike for the Labor Council to oppose the apartheid regime and support a general strike against the genocide. And they tried to shut them down. They were able to speak, and that's very important. So our next speaker is Jeffrey Blankford. I first met Jeffrey during the movement in Central America, where we were organizing in solidarity with Central America and Nicaragua. At the same time we were organizing, the United States was bombing Lebanon with 2,000-pound bombs. I don't know if people remember that, but we were bringing democracy to Lebanon with a battleship that was dropping 2,000-pound bombs. And we brought that up in a coalition here in the Bay Area and said, look, we got to include Middle East. We can't just say Nicaragua and support Nicaragua when the United States is dropping bombs on Lebanon. They're connected. And they said, no, we can't talk about that. We can only talk about Central America, and if we do talk about the Middle East and Lebanon, the union leadership will pull out of our coalition. That's what they said to us. The leadership of the Labor Council will pull out of the coalition, and therefore we can't talk about it. We can't have a united front on Nicaragua and the struggle of the people of the Middle East. And so Jeff Blankford and I formed a committee called the Labor Committee in the Middle East as a result of that, and we also formed a bulletin called Labor Bulletin in the Middle East. So welcome, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm coming from up in Northern California, Mendocino, where Ukiah. Every Sunday from 3 to 4, there is a vigil in front of the courthouse, and we have been getting more positive receptions for support of Palestine from people driving by than from any other issue that people have protested there. It's just amazing. Literally, one day it was raining. Not really hard, but it was raining, and almost every car was beeping for Palestine or waving hands. Today they have sunshine. I wanted to give a credit to Steve because he was the one who suggested back in 1985 that we have something called the Labor Committee on the Middle East. Now, there are a lot of committees formed in the left that don't do anything, and I thought this would be another one. But then I got a hold of an article here. This is from the Hadassah magazine, which is the main Jewish women's organization magazine. Dateline, Washington, February 1983. And the headline is Love of Labor, Israel's Constant Friend. And it begins with, it should not come as a great surprise to visitors to the impressive AFL-CIO headquarters building 1 block from the White House that a statue of the late Golda Meir adorns his lobby, the lobby. After all, with the exception of the American Jewish community, the American labor movement has been over the years the single most important source of support for Israel in the United States. The support has been translated into crucial political actions on behalf of Israel. It has resulted in enormous purchases of Israeli bonds. Al Terestman, the American Israel bond liaison to the American labor movement, said union bond purchases, mostly from affiliates of the AFL-CIO, have been in excess of $250 million over the past 30 years. That was money in those days. $250 million is chump change today. At one point, he noted, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, who do not belong to the AFL-CIO, were the largest single institutional holder of Israel bonds in the world. including 35 million to 40 million worth. The author of that article is as impressive as the material in it. Wolf Blitzer, who went from this article to work for AIPAC, and now, of course, for years has been CNN's main foreign correspondent. They own the media. Oh, they don't own it. Anything to do with Israel, they have their thumb on it. So when I saw this article, I called Steve. I said, okay, let's form the Labor Committee on the Middle East. And then we started putting out a magazine, and I have some copies for people to take afterward. It was the first and only publication to deal with Palestinians not as victims standing in a picture being victimized, but actually as workers, as people who American trade unions could identify with. So I went down and spoke at an SIU state convention in California back in those days, and I got a resolution passed defending Palestinian workers who have been under attack. It was passed. I was red-baited, but that's beside the point. It was sometime in the late 80s, early 90s. So then, I forget his name, but the head of the local, I think 935 of the SCIU, was then appointed to the National Board of SCIU. John Sweeney was the head of SCIU. And this gentleman, the head of SCIU Local 935, took back the resolution with him to get it passed and a stack of our magazines to the board of the SCIU. Well, the SCIU board was going to pass the resolution supporting Palestinian workers at the national board in Washington. And then John Sweeney called a halt in the meeting. And he told them in a break that was not recorded, but I got from the president of the labor union here, was that they could not take a resolution, pass a resolution criticizing Israel and its treatment of Palestinian workers. And this just shows you the power that they have over key sectors of American society that impacts Israel. I would say every sector. So we published, not only did we publish articles about Palestinian workers and also other Middle Eastern workers, but we were the only publication in the United States that was publishing articles from the Israeli press, good articles from the Israeli press, translated by a friend of mine, a well-known Israeli professor named Israel Shahak. So we had, no other publication had these articles. And I'm going to say I brought a number of back copies for you to take. Unfortunately, we haven't found somebody to put them online. And if anybody knows someone who's reliable, who's a whiz at computers and putting documents online, I'd like to talk to them because I have them all on a floppy. If anyone knows what a floppy is. Anyhow, we covered issues that, sadly, our movement in general was not touching at all. The reason we actually started the Labor Committee on the Middle East is because the Palestine Solidarity Committee refused to take a position against the AFL-CIO, no better than the San Francisco Labor Council itself. And they wouldn't take a position against the Histadrut. Now, it turns out that they were also ignorant of the fact that the Histadrut had an office in the SIU building on Golden Gate and had for years been having dinners with the Labor Council to get money and give honors to American politicians like Willie Brown, who's supporting the Histadrut. So just before our committee was starting, I saw the Jerusalem Post had an article in English that Israelis against apartheid in South Africa. That's to distinguish between apartheid in Israel, apartheid in South Africa. Although many Israelis 30 years ago were already calling it apartheid in Israel. In any case, there was an article in the Jerusalem Post, and which I got a copy of, and it said the Histadrut has secret links with Pretoria, building weapons, following there was a progressive, he was actually good on Palestine too, Ron Cohen's revelations on Iskor, that was a steel company owned by the Histadrut working with South Africa, kind of a a cutaway organization. So what we did, Steve wrote a letter to Willie Brown. It says that Willie Brown was going to speak to the Histadrut at this dinner. So we made several flyers. Steve had a letter which he wrote to Willie Brown asking him not to do it. He's known to be against apartheid in South Africa. Why should he be speaking for Israel in this case? So we made a flyer, several flyers. The first one was, what trade union is in business with South Africa? Answer, Histadrut, the Israeli Trade Union Federation. The only trade organization in the world that has direct political and economic ties with South Africa's apartheid regime. And we gave details about that, and then boldface said, should Willie Brown be honored by the Histadrut? Call his office, 5570784, and tell him what you think. And that was a Thursday, October 15th, 5:30, we put this out. Well, that was what the protest was going to be. And there were some other protests at the federal building, and he hadn't replied. So we sent another letter, and then Steve got another letter from Willie Brown saying he understood our concern. He thought it much better to go to the Fairmont Hotel and speak to the Histadrut and address the concerns. Then we put another flyer out. It was cheap, anyway, we put another flyer out saying, do you think Willie Brown's response is a good response? His office actually told me they got millions of phone calls. Millions of phone calls. And John George, who was a councilman here, a black councilman, a progressive generally, but not radical, criticized Willie Brown for speaking to an anti-apartheid organization working in South Africa. I have to keep this up. All right. Okay. Pretend I'm Jim Morrison. Okay, so in any case, so the picket line comes. We did not get support. We individuals in the Palestinian community and supporting Palestine, we did not get support in our protests from any of the groups that claim to support Palestine in the Bay Area. That's important to realize. We contacted them. One person from one group showed up at the very end. But Willie Brown, we had Willie Brown and Walter Johnson, who was a secretary-treasurer of the Labor Council. They had to cross the picket line. They had to go to the back entrance of the Fairmont Hotel so they wouldn't have to cross the picket line. So this is the status. Actually, parenthetically, we had an Israeli-Palestinian actor, well-known, come to San Francisco, and Steve had arranged a meeting with him and Walter Johnson, the secretary forever of the Labor Council. And the actor came, I forget his name, and Johnson said, the first thing I have to let you know is I'm a strong supporter of Israel. I mean, what the hell is happening here? I mean, this country is taken over. And to call that anti-Semitism is just nonsense. It's a racket that's been run to silence people who should be criticizing. In 2014, Jewish Labor Committee to the delegates of the Labor Council. I'll just quote here. The resolution presented to this body claims that the Israeli military is, quote, targeting civilian populations, homes, hospitals, and schools in Gaza. Exactly what they're doing. 2014, it says, dear sisters and brothers, I am writing on behalf of the Jewish Labor Committee Western Region to ask that you oppose the adoption of a resolution which unilaterally blames the state of Israel for the current crisis in Gaza. This is August 10, 2014. For 80 years, the Jewish Labor Committee, a national organization, has been dedicated to providing a bridge between the American labor movement and the Jewish community and our shared commitments to democracy, human rights, and social justice at home and abroad. Jewish Labor Committee is deeply concerned about the ongoing conflict in Gaza and Israel. We are saddened by the human suffering and by the tragic loss of life of both Israelis and Palestinians. We support a two-state solution and are hopeful that the Israeli government and the Palestinian leadership, I roll my eyes, will find the expeditious path back to the negotiation table. We believe that sincere and substantial dialogue between the parties can result in a lasting agreement where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in peace. Now, I want to go back for a moment about the two-state solution, which I've never supported. But in 1988, an Arab-American lawyer, Sally Soliday, who did a lot of prisoner support work as a lawyer, got on the ballot in San Francisco a proposal for a two-state solution. It was winning in the polls at like 38%. At that time, money from wealthy Jewish lobbyists across the country came into San Francisco, bought really expensive mailing pieces, using the memory of Martin Luther King, living person Oscar Arias in Costa Rica, who told them to stop doing it, Harvey Milk, just about everybody you could imagine, to say that the two-state solution was the enemy of peace. And they had a public newspaper, special newspaper came out with every Democrat in California and a local politician in San Francisco saying Prop W for two states is the enemy of peace. Because at that time, in the first years of the Intifada, with the settlements very small, there was a window where there could have been a two-state solution. Wouldn't have been just, but it could have actually happened. But the Democratic Party did not support the two-state solution until it was actually impossible. And suddenly, they're two-staters. That's how morally bankrupt the U.S. political system is and can't be changed.
What I wanted to mention was our attempts, together with the support of Jeffrey as well. You were at several demonstrations and several actions that we tried to do regarding this. I was a delegate to the San Francisco Labor Council during 2021, and I'm a member of UPTI CWA from UCSF, and UPTI CWA passed a resolution in June 2nd, 2021 in support of Palestine, and it was a very strong resolution because it also mentioned, for the first time that I had seen in many other things, it mentioned Histadrut and breaking ties with Histadrut, as well as finishing with the Israeli bonds as well, divesting. And when we brought it to the Labor Council, we joined with about 25 to 30 other delegates of other unions, and we decided we needed to draft a new resolution because mentioning Histadrut might not work in order to garner support. It's almost like a bad word to try to break ties with Histadrut. Histadrut, I'm sure Steve mentioned already, and Jeff mentioned what Histadrut is. Basically, it's a Jewish supremacist trade union. And it's been very central in the creation of the Israeli state since the 1920s. I was here when Steve mentioned that how they would boycott or tell people to boycott businesses that would hire non-Jews in order to push for the settlement of Jewish workers in Palestine. And that was in 1928, and the American Federation of Labor funded that. And AFL-CIO throughout history has been in support of the Israeli apartheid regime. In fact, when we brought the resolution to the Labor Council, we were basically slapped back and was sent to committee, and it was lost in committee, and it was one of the major Zionists on the Labor Council, Olga Miranda, from SEIU Local 87. I can say she's a Zionist because she herself spoke at AIPAC in 2016. So, I mean, she spoke at AIPAC, okay, so she's a Zionist. She basically attacked us. She previously had attacked guests who had come in to speak on behalf of Palestinian children, and saying that people didn't have to worry about stuff that's happening in Palestine. We have to worry about workers here. And then, while we were supposed to be meeting together to decide, it had been sent to committee, so technically we were supposed to have, some discussions, which never happened. The members of the Building and Trade, Rudy Gonzalez, said, no, BDS is off the table. He said that to the news, directly, not to us, to the news. And there was a lot of pushback regarding that resolution, and it did not have Histadrut in it, but it had mentioned the incredible level of upswell of support from unions throughout the United States for the first time in history as a result of the displacement of the East Jerusalem neighborhoods, Palestinians from East Jerusalem, and the renewed attacks in Gaza as well as in the West Bank as well. So it was, we got a letter from the AFL-CIO directly saying to the San Francisco Labor Council that we could not decide or deliberate on a resolution of international relations on issues that they have already taken a stand on, which goes against the entire history of the San Francisco Labor Council, because during the... You did? Oh. Okay, in October of that same year, I was a delegate to the CWA convention, and we brought a very extensive educational resolution to CWA, which we presented to the resolutions committee, and we spoke with them for about an hour and a half, actually. There was very interesting questions. But the head of the resolutions committee, basically, he, as far as I can tell, he vetoed the decision of the rest of including it. And in the actual CWA, he said it was out of order. That resolution was out of order. Because they do have, and they stated, they have links and they work together closely with Histadrut. And Histadrut today is sending money to the IDF reservists. They're having their members' dues be used for sending money to the war effort, basically. Histadrut is.
Because this is not just have to do with Israel, but it has to do with other countries, Chile, Venezuela, countries all over the world. We set up a group called Labor Education Project on AFL-CIO International Operations, LAPIO. And this organization's sole purpose is to educate workers about the international relations of the AFL-CIO, the money that's coming in, because the AFL-CIO, with the CIA, has actually been involved in overturning governments and overturning unions, supporting right-wing unions all over the world. In Japan, in Korea, many, many countries all over the world, Asia, Africa, and in Europe. In fact, the AFL-CIO was involved in supporting the uprising in Ukraine to bring democracy. The AFL-CIO funded unions in Ukraine, and they supported privatization of the Ukrainian economy. The AFL-CIO did, to bring a market economy. They believe that we need to have a market economy. So it's a pro-capitalist trade union federation that works with the CIA for U.S. economic and political policies. So let's open it up if people have questions or comments or any. A lot of information.
Anybody have any questions?
Anybody here old enough to remember Lane Kirkland, who was the head of the AFL-CIO for years? He was at a dinner in Israel while an international group of union representatives from all over the world was in the West Bank. He was having a dinner in Israel, which we wrote about here, in which he bragged that he had been to more Israel bond dinners than any man alive, which is probably true. Now, right now, several states, their treasurers, without any permission or polling the public, have bought millions of dollars, over $100 million of Israel bonds in response to Gaza. Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Missouri, and one other state. One in Pennsylvania, $56 million of the taxpayers' money to invest in Israel bonds. And of course, the United States backs them up. I mean, this is one thing that they don't have to worry about. But this happens, and will you see anything in the U.S. papers about it? Not a word. In the Jewish press, which I read religiously, they have this stuff. Any other questions? Any questions at all? Well, Histadrut, first of all, was more than a trade union. You referred to it. There's one, History of Israel, which said that in 1948, Histadrut flipped the light switch and Israel was formed. Histadrut was involved in everything involved in the creation of Israel. What I would say is try and get a hold of the book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, by Ilan Pappé, an Israeli friend of mine. Steve and I interviewed him out here years ago, and he had to leave Israel because of the danger where he's now at Exeter University in Exeter, London, in England. But now it turns out his Canadian publisher is not going to publish the book. They literally are getting away not just with murder, but with violations that no other country could have dreamed about.
One of the things that everyone should know about as well is that Jeff and I were actually sued by the ADL, and we sued them rather because they were spying on us illegally. They went to my house for a meeting of the Labor Committee in the Middle East, this guy named Roy Bullock, who was called a fact finder for the Anti-Defamation League. Fact finder. It turns out he was doing fact finding not only for Israel, he was doing fact finding for the apartheid government in South Africa at the same time. And he was actually busted by the FBI because he was giving information about South African anti-apartheid activists to the South African regime. And the Israel thing was an aside. But
I also want to say that my union, UPTI, the new leadership, they whitewashed the resolution and took it off of the website. So there's a group of members of us that are asking them to put that resolution back on the website, the 2021. They whitewashed that resolution as well as the other resolutions, the new leadership of my union, UPTI. Okay, so there's a struggle inside trying to get them to put it back on, and there was not much support at the CWA from that same group that were the new leaders of the union to try to push for the CWA resolution at the CWA level, even though there had been an agreement in the Peace and Justice Committee that we would do so. So this is not an internal union thing. This has to do with genocide. So we really need to step up and try to get our leaders to do that. But the only way to do that is organizing among us, among all the rank and file, and not just stay within our little bubble of our own little union. And there's no such thing as dirty laundry if we are not stepping up to fight against genocide. It's not dirty laundry to call people out when they're not doing what they're supposed to do when it comes to supporting the Palestinian trade union movement and BDS.